reference. And one of the very important claims of this classification is that the East Bantu is a later offshoot of Western Bantu. So that's one of the two prevailing models in Bantu classification. The late split model, East Bantu, is a late offshoot of the rest of the family. So Bantu languages first expanded through the forest, and then the East emerged, East Bantu, and this is in contrast with earlier classifications saying that East Bantu was an early split, so East Bantu split off first, and then there was an expansion north of the forest to the interlacustrine area. So this is very important for our understanding of Proto-Bantu, because of course what we consider to be Proto-Bantu is what we consider to be shared retentions. So what survived in present-day Bantu language from the ancestor language, and what we reconstruct is based on the distribution of features in present-day subgroups. So whether East Bantu is a late offshoot or an early offshoot is an important question. Also, of course, the status of Northwestern Bantu within the Bantu tree. So we have heard a lot of references to Northwestern Bantu and contradicting claims about Northwestern Bantu. We heard in Rebecca's talk that in comparative phylogenetic comparative methods, Northwest is getting more weight than the rest. So if a feature appears in Northwest is seen to be more likely or more important for reconstruction into Proto-Bantu. I think this goes against common beliefs or common view on Proto-Bantu reconstruction, or this goes also against some of the claims we have heard that Northwestern Bantu innovated, even if it's the first offshoot. We saw, for instance, in Gerard's talk about the double reflexes, the question whether this needs to be reconstructed to Proto-Bantu or not. As far as I've understood, he would say these are innovations, later innovations of Northwestern Bantu, not to be reconstructed to Proto-Bantu. So this is to be discussed, of course. Similar innovations were discussed in Nancy's talk about the depressor consonants, and this is in zone S in lower branches of the Bantu family. So I think this is one of the things we can discuss. Maybe we could start with this before I give an overview of all the issues out there. So are there any ideas, any insights about the position of Northwestern Bantu or the Eastern Bantu?
Well, one thing that Northwestern Bantu is probably contains the oldest branches of any Bantu tree. Is not a new one inside. Certainly, when I came to Leiden, it was common ground. Mason, Voorhoeven, Larry, the whole Grassfields project, where Voorhoeven was more involved than Nielsen, more optimistic also than Nielsen. But that was because of, and it always all started with Greenberg, of course, and Greenberg in 1948 or maybe in 1950. I think in the articles, the Sim already had this thing. So from the very first that Greenberg wrote about the African language classification, this was known, and it was by the people in this Leiden. It was not contested. So that implied a northwest source of the Bantu expansion, and that the primary branches would be there. Now, so far that was common ground, but there I think is a difference between Voorhoeven and Nielsen.
Wolf was more optimistic to find old retentions in the northwest. Because even that tree does not mean, okay, you can say we can prove the Proto-Bantu-ness of some feature only if it also exists there, but the reverse is not true, certainly not, and has been shown wrong again and again. Because you find things first in the east, because they're clearer there, or they're there, they're clear. And then you look in the northwest, and the northwest is, at least phonologically, has its own life, its own innovations and own changes. And only if you know what to look for, then you find it. That was more, that's my words, but I think Mason was more of that kind that he said, okay, certainly, and these languages have to be better described and more thoroughly, but start with all the Bantu languages and then see what, and there's a qualitative thing. I mean, certain things, certain changes are more likely than others. And so, even if it's absent there, to have many independent innovations in other branches that are not along the natural lines that you expect to recur again and again in Japanese and in Hausa and whatever. But if they are the reverse of it, and they appear many times, then you think it must be old. I mean, if verb goes to p many times, no, it's not.
So one of the questions you were asking too is, can we reconstruct something to Proto-Bantu if it's not attested in the Northwest Bantu?
We can't prove it unless it's outside. We can't prove it, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should do it for the highest note we can, and then look for its traces in the Northwest, because there may only be traces.
But if it's not outside and not in
then
the
we can't be
Northwest,
sure how
we
fast.
say it's a later innovation.
And for some things we cannot say how old they are, like internal reconstructions that are made on the basis of symmetry, say phonological or otherwise, or system kind of things, like noun classes. Internal reconstructions from one language or from many languages, if they have this character, this kind of argument to be applied, then it can be very, very old. It can be Nigerian, but you can't prove it yet. So, and then there's another thing about constantly coming up is this zone S thing. Now I'm very suspicious about it, and I'm suspicious about it certainly since Lyon meeting. You remember when Dennis Kreitzels, whom I miss here, very much, but he had this great paper about Tswana reflexes of Bantu, Proto-Bantu, and he had this sort of skewed reflexes, and then said, well, if it was from Proto-Bantu, he had invented this thing backwards. Proto-Bantu must be this. I mean, in order for the Tswana reflex to be regular and direct, certainly. But in the introduction to his talk, and I don't know if it made it into the printed version, he said very strongly that zone S is not a genetic unit. And he was very adamant about this. And I think he's right. Zone S is, but they have lexical, on lexical basis, they have all these wonderful innovations, all along, but it doesn't work. I mean, chronologically, it doesn't work, and in that case, grammatically, it doesn't work. In that case, the lexical evidence is misleading. And today the depressor consonants there, obviously, this is an area phenomenon. It's not strictly linked to zone S. It also goes a bit outside, and we know that there's another language family that has been spoken there not that long ago in the whole area. So, zone S? No, it is not that we don't reconstruct it because it's only limited. We don't reconstruct it because it's limited to that area, which is not even a branch. And we have a further. I stop.
Tom?
Well, with respect to that it has been known, possibly might be very old, but theory and practice are two different things. If you look at reconstructions, it still happens that many reconstructions are biased towards the numerically dominant forms, and these are Savannah or Eastern Bantu. So I still think it is an issue, even though it has been commonplace theoretically that Northwest is important. So I think.
Paul Newman told me, it's a quote from Joseph Greenberg, and a discussion similar to this. Greenberg said, do I have to tell my learned colleague that evidence has to be weighed, not counted?
In fact, yes, but we should then still look quite skeptically at what we have produced so far.
But
in
if you're
terms of
talking about
reconstruction.
lexical reconstructions, BLR has all that fiabilité, and they show you which zones.
No, I'm referring more to
You're
grammatical
referring to
reconstructions because this is.
So we haven't actually put coefficients on these things to say, well, to what extent are the specifics that we heard about today found in all the different zones. I mean, it has the impression that you can find some part of it, and I'm a little bit surprised at one thing Tito said, which was the difference between Formova and Meersen, because I remember very clearly learning from my visits to Tervuren early on in discussing this kind of thing, that if you don't find it in Zone A, you can't reconstruct it for Proto-Bantu.
That's what he said.
Yeah, that's exactly, Pierre Grégoire made that point a lot, you know, and saying that, you know, because we would have a tendency to do what you're saying, Tom, because it's so easy to take these closely related languages and get a common form, you know, for that, you know, but in terms of either whether it's grammatical morphemes or lexical morphemes, if we don't find it outside, way over there, then we can't assume that what these people have is from the original Proto-Bantu.
It's actually the other way around. It might be okay methodologically, namely to skip a lot of Savannah Bantu. We don't. I think for Proto-Bantu, we possibly don't need 60% of the modern Bantu family. It's like, I mean, nobody reconstructs Germanic looking at widely spoken English or something like this. So it's really it would possibly be enough to look at zone A, B, C.
We need test
You know
languages.
what Proto-Bantu was
We
like.
need test languages of maybe more than 12.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that.
Well,
But
that
then
was
you
a bit provocative. But
Yeah, but
I think if anything, then the other way around, and not.
but like I
I
think
like
one of
Northwest better than primary Bantu.
well, one of the things we heard is does Mason's Bantu grammatical reconstruction does not look too much like East Bantu. So I think with Larry's talk, that's what was also the point you were making, that the reconstruction of these high tones is actually there. Mason was too much influenced by his own work on Zone J language, or the interlinguistic languages. Is that
Which I could not even confirm, because if you look at his Lega Zoom description of Lega, you don't see the high tone that he's talking about. So I don't know where he got it from. You know, it was later that, in fact, or the other one, the whole one. It's basically when Francis and I realized that we'd been ignoring this extra effect in Uganda, that we started to take it seriously, and then the more recent work. I think if you look at those languages I listed, I think almost all of them are very recent, in the last 10 years, something like that. That it's not, you know, it's not that we had very much information, but Davison often kept to himself a lot of stuff. He not only wrote very short articles, but he also, you know, kept things that he didn't even mention. But he had this intuition that there was something there, and of course there is something there. But I think I guess I've got the one disagreement with him so far. Were there any other disagreements with his reconstructions?
But this wasn't a firm one. It was a
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and he very clearly said this requires more
Yeah.
investigation. But it was more than he was signaling.
And
And
he
people
did-
should look at this.
And he did include Herdero.
He did.
He did.
Yeah, he did,
in his
which
list.
is quite different, and there's something.
And of
about-
course, but he,
Yeah,
he said, I can't solve it.
yeah.
So,
There are a few languages that don't fit the pattern.
Mhm.
And so they each have, anytime you've got a contrast in tone coming from verb extensions, you have to look at it
Mhm.
and see, and to what extent are they the same ones? You know, all the same forms, the same meanings, etc., just like we do everything else.
Yeah, Roger?
Yeah, I want to raise a couple of quite different problems. One is, you know, where the boundary between Bantu and Bantu actually lies, which I just find I'm very uneasy about, because I don't actually see that clear list of features that tells me this language is definitely Bantu, this language definitely isn't. And the second one is sampling, and you see this if you look at, say, the phylogeny map. I mean, the sampling of the Bantu realm is incredibly uneven. And that partly reflects the fact that some areas of the Bantu realm are difficult to sample because there's been civil war or what have you. In other words, it just isn't the material on, you know, say Angola is poorly sampled. So to me, this rather compromises statistical and mathematical methods. If you've got a very uneven pattern of what languages you know about, how do you know you're capturing the right phylogeny? So two questions if you think about it.
Any reactions on that?
I think the sample can only be uneven. You never know how many languages have disappeared. You cannot have the whole range of all languages that have existed. So it's uneven by nature. So
the sampling is all available evidence is the only thing you can do, which is a tough proposition, of course, and you do your best. But there's not, Proto-Bantu does not survive in all its traits, no, it does not survive in an orderly way. Anyway.
No, but that's not my point. My point is, if you look at the map, say, where there was some, what you take, there are great areas where there was nearly nothing, you know. That's not because there aren't Bantu languages spoken there. It's because the nature of research is very
You
challenging.
don't postpone until what you do with what you have.
So, Roger, what would you propose then?
Well, I'm less of a believer in lexical cognition and so on, and more of a believer in the old-fashioned comparative method. And it seems perfectly reasonable to say we cannot say much about languages in this area because there isn't any proper data. You know, there aren't the dense grammatical descriptions. In other words, let's be honest about the lacunae in available data. I mean, it does seem to me there is some argument suggesting there was an early Bantu expansion down the west coast of West Africa, you know, down towards Angola. I mean, I was very struck by reading some stuff from Namibia, you know, about how similar some of it seemed to some A group languages. Maybe that's just impressionistic. But at least there's an argument that there was another thread of Bantu expansion down the west. Who knows if it's true? But I'm saying they know some things, but let's be honest about what we don't know.
Yeah, if I can add to this, I think this is a right point because certainly if this phylogeny is taken as a reflection of the initial expansion of Bantu speech communities, or as we have, in my opinion, a bit wrongly or overstatedly claimed in the 2015 paper, this reflects the phylogeny of present-day Bantu languages which are in the sample and which have survived, of course, the history of. But if you start to compare with archaeological data, you see that there might have been Bantu languages in the course of history that have disappeared in favor of newly arrived Bantu languages, and that there have been probably waves of expansions which led to the extinction of pre-existing Bantu languages. And of course these those languages that have disappeared can never be factored in any phylogenetic classification. So I think that's why we should be careful by claiming that the phylogeny of present-day Bantu languages, it gives us a robust insight into the classification, but saying that this reflects the initial migration, I think that's a bit overstated. And of course, but I'm not sure whether that would lead to a dramatic new view on what Proto-Bantu was like. If you agree that reconstruction, it's shared retentions, what we find as retained in the different Bantu subgroups. I don't know whether access to these lost languages would dramatically change our view on what Proto-Bantu looks like.
That paper you did on split tree names, I was very impressed by that because it showed very clearly you have tree names that are split between two, and then you have an innovative wave which must have overwritten the Bantu languages that were previously there, presumably. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. So these give us insights into, and I presume if you push that point further, you might find split grammatical things that are shared between the two areas as well, which are overwritten by the expansion, later expansions. No?
Well, I would say that would only complicate our insights or understanding of internal classification, but not necessarily change our view on how the language at the top of the tree looked like.
I'm rather curious to hear what Rebecca has to say about what would you ideally have as height in your sample, and how would you ideally weigh these languages, and in response to the previous discussion?
I think we have done the best we could with the data we have, and I agree with Koen that maybe there was another migration wave that with Bantu languages that had disappeared, but unfortunately with the data we have, we can't do much more than what we have done so far. So. And
Tom's extreme proposal of just leaving out all the eastern.
Yes, I do not agree with that, but I think if you want to reconstruct proto-language, you have to take into account all the languages, and the comparative method that I use do give more weight to Northwestern languages, but you cannot change that, because if we are using phylogeny in order to try to reconstruct the proto-language, you have to take into account the evolutionary history of these languages, and you cannot change that. And maybe, yes, of course, Northwestern have had more innovations, and that's why it's different from Eastern Bantu languages, but unfortunately, with my model, you cannot change that. We are using phylogeny because we are trusting, we believe that the languages have evolved in a certain way, but we cannot say, okay, because we know that there have been many innovation in Northwestern languages, we should give less weight to Northwestern. It doesn't work like that. We have to apply the method like that, and what is on the top of the tree will have more weight than what is at the bottom of the tree, and that's like that. But then, when we look at the result, we can be cautious and say, okay, we have had this reconstruction, be careful, the tree, the model does like that and give more weight to Northwestern languages, and therefore we know that they have had many innovations, and therefore we have to be careful with our results. That's the best we can do it, I guess.
Just, I don't know, Rebecca, I mean, my point was not to, you don't need Savannah Bantu to reconstruct a phylogeny. I mean, Proto-Bantu is very different from the phylogeny of a family. So when I asked how is Proto-Bantu, then that's what I meant. But for a phylogeny, you have to take all the languages into account to get a phylogeny. I mean, in Proto-Bantu is very different from all the things that happened after Proto-Bantu, namely the development and diversification of the language family. So I think, Peter, you misunderstood my
yes.
remark. Jeff?
Yes.
So we're discussing partly preferential treatments of different areas, but I'm concerned also about the preferential treatment of different time horizons or different periods. That, you know, again, everything, if it's not Proto-Bantu, then it's not worth discussing. If it's not, you know, this is Proto-Indo-European, without Proto-Slavic, without Proto-Germanic, without Proto-Indo-Iranian, it just seems to me very difficult that for us to be reconstructing an early stage without getting our hands on intermediate stages. And that's a project where I think we all agree that Proto-East Savannah is not Proto-Bantu. But that shouldn't stop us from actually explicitly describing what is, you know, Proto-East Bantu. And then we can see it also as a system, of grammar as a system. We need to be able to see that with whatever its most recent additions, changes are. So I'm wondering when and how is our method to reconstruct intermediate stages of this, which will give us a better purchase on the earlier stages.
Yeah, I think this is also an old methodological question within reconstruction. Should you reconstruct from sample languages equally or evenly distributed within the family, or should you reconstruct first intermediate stages and then from those intermediate stages reconstruct the Proto-Bantu? And I think some people here have clear opinions on that. But Dima wanted to...
Just, joining Jeffrey and also about the question of division between Bantu and the position of West. When you look at the map that your paper about the Bantu migration, you see that nodes 1 and 2 they're actually very close, and so where it's not really statistical margin of error in separating them. Whereas node 3, which is very separate, very distant from the original grasslands area, more or less. So, have people tried, or is it worth trying it, to say that, let's say, Proto-Bantu starts at node 3, and we can make something coherent starting from that node? Because also the structure of the languages in Northwest, as far as I understand, it's also very messy, so that there's not really like a tree-like structure, so we don't know what's supposed from what. So like what Gérard said today, so there are many different clades possible there. So just an idea.
But that's one of my, that's one of the questions I was thinking about. If something is not attested in Northwest Bantu, should that then mean that Proto-Bantu, as reconstructed by Mason, or as Proto-Bantu as we reconstructed, it's rather the ancestral language of narrow Bantu minus Northwest, or is it still, is it the later innovation at node 3, or is it still, can it still be considered to be Proto-Bantu including Northwest? Of course, if there is external evidence from Bantoid or elsewhere Benue Congo, Niger Congo, it can be reconstructed up to node 2 or 1, but if not, then the question is, so I think Tilo would say, if I've understood well, it can still be reconstructed to 1 or 2 and Northwest lost it. Others might think, no, that's a later innovation, it's a later Proto-Bantu. But that all depends on how we look at the tree of.
So then on node 3 won't get a more coherent picture.
I think no. Larry?
May I say something?
Of course.
Thank you. What I would like to draw the attention of everyone here is to the following point. When we're talking about Northwestern Bantu, we talk about a certain type, what we conceive to be a certain type of typological, of phonological development, and consequently of, for instance, the loss of final vowels and so on and so forth, and so the development of a rather isolating type of language, right? But
there are a number of Northwestern Bantu languages which are not like that, which are perfectly agglutinative, which show the same characteristics as the Eastern Bantu, so-called classical Eastern Bantu show, and they are genuine. As far as I can see, they are genuinely integrated within the normal way. So I believe that those Northwestern Bantu languages that develop to the isolating type, it's due to contact with the non-Bantu languages, right? And that the languages that would more represent the original type of language, even for Northwestern Bantu, would be languages like the Sawabantu languages, the coastal Bantu languages, or Bobe, to quote my favorite language once again, which have characteristics. For instance, when we talk about Northwestern Bantu, like for instance, with the object markers follow the verb, right? You have isolated, so you have all the elements are separate, right? So you have the subject marker, and then you have the verb with several, and then you have the object. But there are many languages among, not all of them, but among the Sawabantu languages, there are many languages that have the object marker in the canonical Bantu position that is before the verb stem. Bobe is like that, Batweri is like that, if I'm not wrong. Right. So that must be the original situation. The others have lost it.
Well, I think you raise an important point here, but if I refer to Northwest Bantu, I don't refer to it as you do. Because as you do, a lot of languages which belong to like zone B, 50, 60, 70 would also be part of Northwest.
No.
If I refer to
no.
Yes, it would. If I refer to Northwestern Bantu, it's the Northwestern Bantu that, like, since Basta et al. 1999 lexico-statistical classification, those languages that branched off first, so it's Zone A and B10, B20, and B30. So it's Northwestern, not as a typological profile, but as a genetic subgroup, of course, based on basic vocabulary. So I don't say that's the right stand, but I think it's important for the people here that Northwestern in Bantu studies, it's known under two disguises. So some people consider it to be a genetic subgroup based on basic vocabulary. That's called what is called Northwest Bantu. That's, if we say that's one of the first offshoots, it's in that sense. And then you have that Northwest Bantu as defined in like how Larry refers to it as how to become a qua verb. The Northwestern as a typological profile with minimality constraints on the verb stem, but these constraints also exist in certain Western Bantu languages beyond what is the genetically basic vocabulary defined Northwestern Bantu. So I think we should define, if we speak about Northwestern Bantu, we should say clearly in what sense we understand Northwestern.
That's why I'm trying to define an innovation
very
to define it.
I have a follow-up question on that, which was already in my mind. Are there any Northwestern Bantus, by your understanding of Northwestern, that have multiple object markers? And if there aren't any, does that mean that that's an innovation in a more southern and eastern group? Well, southern group because there are western languages that have it. So, that was a concrete example that I was thinking of.
Well, some would say I think Tom would say it's the old situation, and Larry would say this is a retention. If you have multiple object markers,
But we see the dynamic in Northwest Bantu to lose object markers. Sure, there are languages in Northwest that have them, but they only have one, and we can understand how they could lose that. I mean, I'm advocating for a certain position here, I'm not sure, but
yes, of course.
I'm not convinced that if the Northwest, by the definition, doesn't have it, that it wasn't in Proto-Bantu.
Again, it depends on how natural the changes are.
Yeah,
If you have that
exactly.
position for an object, is it natural for some languages to innovate having more than one? If you started with more than one, is it natural to then restrict it and say, now we're only gonna have one?
And how do we
And
know
I
what's
think, I don't know if
natural?
I have a clear, to me,
How
they
do
both
we
seem
know
very
what's
reasonable.
natural?
They both seem like very reasonable directions.
Well, how do we know what's natural? Do we know
By
from
actually
other
seeing the
languages?
tested changes and or having a functional motivation that we could think of what would drive something, whether it's a sound change or a grammatical change. And that's how we, take Northwest Part A, B, whichever parts of them, is there something there? Because I thought that from way back when, was it first Henry Cheese's work on this lexicosstatistically, or also Heinous and all that, that the idea was as you go west, you're getting less and less closely related. Those guys are much more distant from each other than over here, and therefore it's not, it doesn't seem like you would be able to glom them together and say that they are one thing, the way you can do with certain branches that are further east.
If you
and
take
south.
the article of the chapter of Bastin-Piron in your book by Larry Hyder and Jean-Marie Humbert, they give a classification based on lexicostatistical data. They have a Northwest subgroup there.
Yeah, but that's-
I mean, it's called Northwest and it includes Zone A.
Okay, I guess I was asking whether if people find that
But
persuasive, you know.
it's called the Northwest. It includes Zone A minus A40, A60, which is called Mbambis, which is the bridge between narrow Bantu and wider Bantu, and you have those floating groups, and it includes B10, B20, B30, and that's also when the phylogenetic methods, the same subgroupings reappear, of course, based on the same kind of data, so that's maybe not so surprising, but the fact to get with different methods the same subclasses shows that these groupings are maybe robust and not. Yeah.
I'm a bit surprised. I mean, the late phylogenetic classification doesn't give Northwest at all as a group. It has all the other subtrees out of which other things relate. But I mean, Bastin has Northwest as a group, but your phylogenetic classification has one node and then everything splits off in a nice tree. So that's the.
But it's still Northwest versus the rest.
Doesn't that go back to Dennison's Steps article? Didn't they were the first person to take out these A60 and so on and say, no, that's the origin of that, I think.
I didn't get it.
Sorry, you know the Benson Step article 1977, where they looked at this question, were they not the first people to take out these A60, A40 languages and say, hey, these are really different from all the rest, there must be a split here?
I don't know.
Look it up, it's an interesting article.
I think Mason used to call this the Bantu onion, right? And meaning that any tree that was proposed, and the recurring feature is that you have a split between a very few languages, or maybe one depending on the size of the sample, and the rest. And the rest would split into very few, and the rest would be, and so on. Certainly at the early stages. If you come further down to, say, Savannah Bantu, then it may be a bit different. But, and in that situation, if that is true, and I still see it in modern classifications, whatever their label is, all based on this country. If that is true, the question where is the border is entirely useless, because you have all these nodes, and what we call Bantu and what not. There's no boundaries. Wasn't a country. I mean, it wasn't. So you are free to call any of those Bantu. There's no huge split between the next in an onion. What is the interior of an onion?
But then you can include Jarawan and Tikar.
You could, yeah, you could.
Yes, I know, but this is, I think this is a bit unfair, because everybody right now thinks Bantu, Gatu. And this stops at A10. And now's the question, we want to construct something, and then somebody says, oh, wait a second, you know, I want to pull in Tikar, I want to pull in Mambila, and so I do think it's a more serious problem than just saying, well, who cares what Bantu is, because then there is a kind of terminological misunderstanding.
Well, if you're talking about Bantu grammatical reconstructions, that's probably one thing. If by pulling in something else we manage to bring it up, that would be okay, but I don't see the problem here, actually. Because we're talking about, even when we look at the Northwest, if I wanted to know what was original, I would not look at the isolating languages that hardly have any morphology. I would look at the ones that still have something. And so if by going out a bit to Tiv or Mambila or whatever, it clarifies something that we have inside, then I think that would make sense. There's no limit on the kind of weighing, as Tilo said, of evidence. We just have to see and then discuss it. We don't have, unfortunately, the kind of subgroups in Indo-European, typically, that we could rely on within Bantu proper, quote, narrow Bantu. That we know in some cases. Maybe I remember, I wanted to bring this up earlier, Tilo, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember early on when Tegrin introduced Zone J, you were very upset. Because you said this is going to give the impression that the zones are genetic. Because the idea was to take some of D and some of E because they were felt to be very closely related, and then make that into a zone. And then we would start to say, oh gee, that must be, therefore M must be genetic, and H or, which didn't have Pudu in it.
Yvonne did this all the time, reassigning languages, giving it new numbers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the value of the numbers was not the genetic side. Yeah. The value was our referential being able to.
And there was no end to it, because what she called in 1971 H 41 or so, that would be B in 72, and back to H.
Some have two numbers,
and some
A and an H.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe if there are, yeah?
No, I was just going to say that in terms of us not having groups, I think one of the potential uses of Rebecca's and the 2015 chart is that we do start to have some established nodes. In a few years, if the phylogenetic tree gets more established, or then we can talk about node 5, node 7, or something. And these nodes are supposedly representing groupings. So
except that they're not intuitive to anyone working on the languages. It has to do with how many with shared vocabulary. So if you're saying, like, if you look at Germanic language, we know they're Germanic. Where there's no question they can't be Slavic, right? So, and if we could get to that level,
that's right. If
we
get there,
need the evidence from this kind of stuff, to really convince us the grammatical stuff.
Yep.
And that's what's going to convince us in our everyday work, I think. That is, if you're interested in reconstructing and he's actually identifying some really solid, substance kind of stuff. And that's what's hard to do because everything is so connected.
At a certain stage, I guess I, like many people, I'm somewhat skeptical of the lexical statistics, but I've come to believe in, say, what I would call South Bantu, which is a little part of this, which is where I think there are morphological features that overlap with exactly with what is reconstructed here from the lexical side. So, again, if they're big enough lexical differences, you would think that they do represent isoglossals of different communities. So, I agree that in principle, the grammatical and the lexical or isoglossals can be different. But at some stage, they should overlap.
It's one. It's the only one that has preserved.
Take something, you take Luya. There are 5 vowel ones and there are 7 vowel ones. And what was the other one? It was Derek here? Yeah, because Derek was the one to say, you believe in Luya? And you think that you could get the Bakusi type, you go get it with the Lagoli type, or the, because they're so radically different. And it would be like putting the Sujut Swana group together with Nguden. They both have vowelization of labials by W, by the way, but that, all this stuff is very careful.
You did not.
Well, I agree with you, I don't believe in S, zone essence.
But if it's convenient to say I'm going to talk about zone S, it's not shown up. Or whatever, I mean, you see that too, right? When I say zone S, I really mean this. Yeah.
But I would say these lexicon-based phylogenetic statements, and I think that's a problem in the literature, should not be taken as definite statements or like the answer to the Bantu expansion or to the classification, but they can be useful points of reference. If you have isoglosses of grammatical features, how will you can interpret them and see to what extent they match, they do not match with what classifications based on basic vocabulary tell us. These are types of evidence that add or complement each other. But I mean, it's always if you have like we can discuss about the CARP. We will discuss. You say the CARP template. You cite 3 East Bantu languages, and then you say it's probably also it exists in Proto-Bantu. Yeah. Okay. Possible.
Pan-Bantu.
Yeah, Pan-Bantu. Well, I mean, it's not. It's like if you say. To what do you refer? To what distribution in the tree? And these are of course not absolute statements about Bantu classification, but rather it's a point of reference. It's not does the grammatical evidence match the lexical evidence, or does it not? And what if yes? What does it mean? If no, what can we conclude from that? But people seem to have or I see some people would say these lexical-based classifications I have no use at all. It's just they just mislead. They are misleading and they don't tell us anything. That's what I would think.
Maybe, but wouldn't it make sense, and it is like what you're doing with your Congo project, to say, okay, we've got this group here, and if this is something that was delineated by the phylogenetic method, now let's see what correlates with that. Is it look at the grammatical properties, phonological properties, that's maybe different from people from all the languages around it. That would make a lot of sense. You know, I mean, but I was reminded of something. I remember young Vogel was really excited when Jacqueline Leroy discovered in Moncton, the Bantu language, that the class 10 prefix, a very different vowel system, very different almost anything. The class 10 agreement on the number 3 is the equivalent of changing Satu to Satu. Okay? I said, okay, that immediately meant that Moncton goes into some group. Including that, we see that stuff in Uganda, we see it, it was that specific, that having a grammatical, a phonological effect and a regular effect of a specific agreement marker on a numeral in this case. You say, okay, that doesn't strike me as something that would accidentally happen again. And of course we have other reasons to do that, to say that the Eastern Grassroots Bantu language form some kind of unit, narrow Bantu at some level. But that's really striking, and that's where we look. If we were looking closer in at these groups, it's not that I would take them at face value or not, but I would want to follow it up with the other kind of work that we're presumably here to talk about.
Yeah, let's maybe, but it's 10 to 6, let's say 10 minutes. But we haven't discussed phonology yet, or I think one of the issues, and I think everyone is eager to do so before we get to the beers. But so one of the issues that was, and it's not just phonology, but to a certain extent, I think one of the issues that was recurrent in several of the papers, and I heard certain interesting claims about that, is whether augments
the augment should be reconstructed to Proto-Bantu or not, and if so, if it would need to be reconstructed as a consonant vowel or just as vowels, and whether it should be reconstructed, if it's reconstructed, whether it should be reconstructed with a high tone or all high tones or all with different tones per noun class. So I don't know, any new insights, opinions on that? Mark?
Well, I don't think it can be reconstructed in Proto-Bantu. I think it's part of a cycle, and you see renewals all the time. The fact that very many Bantu languages allow demonstratives to be pre-nominal, and then they tend to become shorter, and they tend not to occur with the augment, that is a sign of renewal. You find many languages like Zamba, for instance, or Zamba in zone C, where the Bokamba, I believe, analyzes the nominal prefix with a high tone. So you think there is a reflex of the augment there, but it also has an augment which has a CV shape. So that looks like a renewal of the augment, and it's the only language in the wider area that has a CV augment. And you find, sorry, and it shows, it has a function or a meaning that puts it early in Greenberg's cycle. So, I think you see very many cases or like these of types of evidence for renewal. Also outside of the Bantu languages, it's something that, I mean, demonstratives tend to aggregate to the noun, and that's just what the augment is, I think.
But we cannot exclude into at what stage Proto-Bantu was in that cycle.
No, you don't know. No, we can't.
It raises the question about how we would know that two augments come from the same source. And presumably, again, unless everything recycles, if you find, for example, languages where you look at the augment after a negative verb, does that count? Or is that something that's really natural? It depends on what the function was. But there certainly are some languages that are fairly close to each other that share that property in one way or another. That is either obligatorily it cannot be there, or optionally can be there with a difference in referentiality. You know, so those look very like they're from the same cycle. If you want to think of it that way. Yeah.
Gerard, you think the Comorian is a separate one, right?
Yeah. It acts like a determiner, right? So it's more or less like the article défini in French, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's also the same situation as in Sukuma and Nyamwezi and in Bobe, I have to say. Exactly the same function.
Sounds like we need another dissertation on the augment.
So we have already two issues on which we can revise Bantu grammatical reconstruction. Even if Mason was very careful about these points, but so the short causative and passive should not be reconstructed with a high tone, and we throw away the augment.
And keep it as a tentative.
That's not bad after a first day, I would say. The workshop, so unless someone else still wants to add to the discussion, something to the discussion, or
I would like to just give a brief thought, very general, but relevant for tomorrow and afterwards, I think, which is also inspired by Pimeno Muradi's Langalin project. So what they did there is look at syntactic parameters in the nominal domain for mostly Indo-European languages, and cook up a phylogenetic tree from that, which looks remarkably the same as what you get from lexical reconstruction. So that's very promising as a morphosyntactic reconstruction, and that's where we get to a methodological point, because the sort of parameters they use tend to be a bit more abstract than just what you observe. So that's one of the questions that I will keep in mind for the coming days. What level of abstraction should we compare things? So should we just say, well, it has, I don't know, it has, say that conjoint-disjoint alternation. It has a Ra particle, or it has some kind of opposition, which is obviously much more abstract than just the form. And that's one of the things that I find really interesting. What kind of, how much analysis do we need to do before we can actually compare like with like, which is more relevant, I think, for the functional, more syntactic stuff, more so than the phonology.
Can I say something? Yannicke, have you read Michael Dunne's paper of 2005 where he describes some abstract syntactic criteria, and he said, based on his analysis, that this type of criteria does contain very strong signal for historical signal. I could send you the paper, but that's that is in agreement with what you just said.
Yeah. Which still gives us the challenge for our individual phenomena that we're working on, to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone for keeping, for remaining so focused until the end. Tomorrow morning we start again at 9:30. Sharp is the same room as today. Sharp again. Just for your information, there will be over there. There will be no coffee at the arrival, so the first coffee break is after the first session, so be aware of that. And for those of you who would like to have a drink, I think we would meet in the Café Boreuil. It's a big pub or a big cultural center. If you leave the building, you go to the left, and around the corner to the left, you go down the street, you'll see it at your right hand side. You'll pass the big university building, the rectorate, and there you have Café Boreuil. For those of you who like to have a drink after the talk, you can meet there anytime.